Webinar focuses on interpreting Wikidata for achievement and oral language results. Let's start with which scores you want to be interpreting. In online scoring, you are given the option to select scores to include in your summary report. We recommend choosing standard scores with ranges, percentile ranks with ranges, and RPI scores. Standard scores have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. 90 to 110 is considered average. The descriptors given to the different score ranges, such as average, low average, high average, etc., have not changed from the Woodcock-Johnson 3 and can be found in the manual on page 84. Percentile ranks describe performance as a relative standing in relation to the norm sample. RPI scores are criterion reference scores that reflect a student's proficiency on tasks for which the average age or grade mate would demonstrate 90% proficiency. More on this later. Percentiles indicate the percentage of the comparison group who scored the same as or lower than your student. A score at the 56th percentile means that the student scored as well as or better than 56% of the students their age or grade in the norm sample. Here's a little cheat sheet for interpreting extended percentile ranks. 99th percentile means your student scored as well as or better than 99 of 100 students. 99.9 means as well as or better than 999 of 1,000. First percentile means your student scored as well as or better than 1 of 100 students. And 0.1 means as well as or better than 1 of 1,000. RPI scores were there in the WJ3, but no one knew what they meant. They're actually quite interesting. Strictly speaking, an RPI of 16 over 90 means if the average student is 90% successful in a task, this student would be 16% successful. This is very similar to the eye chart of 40 over 20, meaning that you see at 40 feet what the norm group sees at 20 feet. Because of some statistical factors, like the fact that the shape of the distribution of the scores is different for the same test at different ages, a standard score or percentile doesn't tell us how far below the classroom work our student really is. While standard scores and percentiles tell us how many students in the norm sample are worse off than our student, the RPI tells us where our student is in relation to grade level expectations. The standard scores and percentiles are calculated by determining where the middle 50% of students is. That doesn't take into account whether those students are successful in the curriculum or not. So, RPI is a criterion reference score, while the standard score is norm referenced. The RPI helps us know how concerned we should be when standard scores and percentile ranks are below average. In first grade, the 10th percentile may be an RPI of 8 over 90, whereas in 10th grade, the 10th percentile may be an RPI of 60 over 90. Moving forward, comparing RPI scores may be a better way of showing growth towards grade level proficiency. However, this is meant to be a general guide, and we wouldn't want to go as far as trying to write annual goals based on this information. Remember that standard scores from one 3-year evaluation to another show whether or not the student moved up in line in the order of test scores. If the student's standard score is 80 at assessment 1 and 80 again 3 years later, they have still made progress, but have stayed in roughly the same place in the ranking of their peers. The RPI would help you to see if they've moved closer to the curricular expectations. Growth from an RPI of 40 over 60 to 40 over 90 to 70 over 90 would give an approximate indicator of the growth the student made in relation to meeting grade level standards. Let's go over this again with a visual. Please excuse the very basic nature of the illustration. The blue curve might be a distribution of scores for letter word ID for 3rd graders. There will be much variation in reading ability in 3rd grade, so the scores will be spread out. The red curve might be a distribution of letter word ID scores for 10th graders. There will be less variation as most 10th graders will read most of the words, and so the scores will clump much closer to average. Standard scores and percentiles, remember, tell us where a student falls in line if we were to line up all the scores the students received. That student at the 20th percentile scored as well as or better than 20% of the students in the norm sample. Let's look where 20th percentile might fall in each of our distributions. In order for 20% of our scores to be below our student, the 20th percentile falls closer to average for our 10th grader versus our 3rd grader. Our 3rd grader will be farther from average classroom work. Thus, we could assume that doing grade level work would be more difficult for our 3rd grader whose below average skills might mean she is barely reading. Our 10th grader, on the other hand, could be reading at a 5th grade level and still be able to function in the classroom. But isn't average average? You may find that two students with a standard score of 90 have differing RPI scores. What this tells us is that for some tests, there will be many more kids at certain ages who are not at the criterion of average grade level work in the classroom. For these skills at these ages, general education should expect a wider range of skills within their students and should differentiate accordingly. This does help explain the situations where your teacher is frustrated because Susie can't do the work in the classroom, but you tell her Susie scored a 90 on the Woodcock-Johnson and so she must be average. The teacher could be right. Her skills are not at grade level. However, there are many other students whose skills aren't at grade level either due to the normal progression of development of that particular skill. This chart gives helpful descriptors to guide you in interpreting RPI scores. As you can see, anything below an 81 over 90 indicates some degree of difficulty. I think you will find that a lot of scores we have considered average represent some degree of difficulty in the classroom. Remember, the typical classroom has students with a range of skills, including a group whose skills would be considered below grade level. Here are some sample statements for including RPI data in reports. You will notice that I didn't choose to actually report the RPI numbers, as the likelihood of the numbers detracting from your reader's understanding is much greater than the likelihood that these numbers will increase the reader's understanding. Using the language from the interpretation chart, I can look at the RPI and make statements about the connection between the student's test scores and his or her ability to complete grade level work in the classroom. First, testing indicates that Susie's proficiency in grade level word identification is limited, and she will have a very difficult time reading words at grade level. Her comprehension is limited to average, and grade level comprehension will also be somewhat difficult. Another example. Joe's math scores show that his math problem-solving skills are average and classroom tasks should be manageable. However, his math calculation skills are very limited, and calculating without a calculator will be extremely difficult. Therefore, he should be allowed to use a calculator in math and science classes. As with any test score that is statistically derived, you would want to make sure the statements you make about the classroom, based on RPI scores, are consistent with what you know about what the student actually does in the classroom. We wouldn't want to say the test says classroom work will be very difficult when a student is doing fine in the classroom. Along the lines of what we just discussed with RPI data, please ensure that you don't take scores at face value. If a test score seems inconsistent with other data or with what you know about a student's skills from working with them, double-check to make sure that score is accurate. Double-check to make sure you calculated the raw score correctly and entered it into the system correctly. Did you remember to count the items before the basal? This is a common error. Then revisit the student's behavior during testing. Did they appear attentive, tired, non-compliant? Don't ignore the fact that the student's behavior could be interfering with his or her performance. You should always include a statement about whether you consider your test scores to be valid. If there were factors that call into question the validity of testing, you must state those. If you feel your scores are not valid, do not report the numbers. As soon as someone sees them in writing, they're likely to assume they're accurate and that they may not read the fine print to see that you question the score's validity. When comparing scores to previous testing, remember the Woodcock-Johnson 3 and the Woodcock-Johnson 4 are different tests. You cannot measure how much growth a student has made by directly comparing scores from the 3rd edition to those from the new test. You can speak in generalities. His score was below average in reading comprehension 3 years ago, but is now in the average range. But don't directly compare RPI or standard scores. It is common for scores to be lower on the new test than they were on the old test, due to the renorming process and changes made to the tests. When reviewing scores to include in your evaluation report, avoid score overload. The WJ gives you many cluster scores that are simply different combinations of the same few subtests. Make sure that you're not giving multiple numbers that say the same thing. Stick to the 8 primary cluster scores. It makes sense to bring in subtest scores if the subtests within a cluster are discrepant from one another, thus making the cluster score less meaningful. For example, if you're looking at basic reading skills and you have a score of 80, and the student scores on letter word ID and word attack are 90 and 75, you would want to report the subtest scores, as the cluster score is not telling the whole story. However, if the student scores an 80 on basic reading skills, with an 82 on letter word identification, and 79 on word attack, reporting these subtest scores does not add much information. So when we talk about focusing on the 8 clusters that most closely align with SLD criteria, here is what we are referring to. We recommend you print out the test selection table handout and star these clusters in the lists across the top. When you're assessing academic skills for students with other disabilities, when SLD is not a factor, your focus may shift to broad scores for simplicity's sake. We'll talk more about that in a bit. This concludes this webinar.